Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
And I'm your co host, Cameron McAllister. In this episode, we talk about an episode of Freakonomics that was recommended by one of our listeners. Thank you very much. And the subject was Patrick Deneen, who is a figure of some controversy and a bestseller, written books like Why Liberalism Failed and recently Regime Change. This will be a helpful episode to you as we wrestle through some of the crises of our moment as a current political order appears to be crumbling, and we don't really know what will replace it. But we talk, I think, constructively about some of the challenges that we face, and really the challenge of painting a positive vision of a common life for all of us. Like, share, and subscribe, and tell others about us. If you like what we do, you can also support our work. You can go to www.toltogether.com. Thank you so much.
Today is a bit of a reaction video, I think, to a Freakonomics podcast episode 644 titled Has America Lost Its Appetite for the Common Good? And this is an interview with the host of the Freakonomics podcast. It was a book. Now it's a podcast also with Patrick Deneen, who we have quoted before. And the reason we're doing this is because a listener, hey, Colleen, ran across this and sent it to us and said, hey, we've heard you guys mention Patrick Deneen before, and we think this would be an interesting thing for you guys to chew on a little bit. I know Colleen. I also happen to know that Colleen and her husband run a farm, and Colleen listens to the Thinking Out Loud podcast while washing eggs. So there you go. When you listen to and support Thinking
Love
Out
it.
Loud, you're also supporting the production of good quality eggs somewhere in this great country. So thanks, Colleen, for the tip. I sent this right over to Cameron. We both listened to it, and he's like, hey, that's a great topic. Has America lost its appetite for the common good? And it is true that we have quoted Patrick Deneen in the past, and he's a bit of a controversial figure. So, or just interesting. Maybe I don't know what to think of him. And so maybe before we jump into the broader conversation around the concept of the common good, Cameron, can you give us a little crash course for those who are listening who think like, why should I know who Patrick Deneen is, or where maybe have I heard his name or some
Mm-hmm.
ideas?
Sure. So, grew up Catholic. He is a Catholic. Grew up in small town in the Northeast, and went to Rutgers University. Was an absolutely fantastic student. Went on to do a PhD in political theory. Taught at Princeton University. Was a registered Democrat for most of his adult life, and indeed worked with the Clinton administration with speech writing and some of the behind the scenes strategy. So so I think most people would associate him with the right now, but he is not registered. So he leans right and
He
is
says he has
sympathetic
sympathies to the
to
populist momentum of our current time, but has always been a Democrat.
correct. So one thing you learned about him in the interview is he gives careful answers. So here's what else you need to know about him. He was catapulted into unlikely superstardom, and superstardom being a relative term here. Okay, in the world of
Academics.
books, okay, in the world of books that are published with Yale University Press, his was a surprise bestseller, and it was a case of the book coming out at just the right time. It's called Why Liberalism Failed. There's a good chance that many of you heard that title. You've certainly heard Nathan and I talk about it. I would recommend the book. It's a good book. He is also, along with being a gifted academic, he's a very good writer. And you'll know that if you read enough books written by academics, that the two do not always go together. But he writes very well, and it's a quick read too. It condenses a whole lot of thought in very few pages, which is an impressive feat. But it came out. Its release coincided with the election of Donald Trump. So this was a time. So think about, for many people, this was so many within elite sectors, educated sectors. This was an absolute political catastrophe. And now here comes a book by a political theorist titled "Why Liberalism Failed." So
Ooh. You know what other book
former
did
President
very
Barack
well
Obama.
at that time, at that exact moment? You know another
What's
book
that?
that did very well? Hillbilly Elegy by a guy named J.D. Vance that nobody had heard of at the time, who's explaining what the rest of America thinks. So there was that kind of 2016, what in the world happened kind of moment that a lot of these books that were explaining a paradigm shifting alternative or a different paradigm for people to, mainly your coastal elites, to think about the rest of America. This definitely, and those two guys are going to be connected here in the future. But anyway, I just wanted to interrupt with that tidbit.
Yes. So, and funny you should mention J.D. Vance. We'll bring him in here in just a second. But at the time, this also explains why one of the people who talked positively about the book was former President Barack Obama. It was written about in the New York Times. I believe David Brooks devoted an entire column to the book. So it got all of this attention, and suddenly Patrick Deneen gets all of this attention. Also, as he points out in the interview, most of that book was written a decade prior.
Mm-hmm.
So
Can you
a
give us
lot
the
of this
30
was
second
already
summary? Can you give us the 30-second summary? Like, what's the trailer, the teaser for somebody who might want to pick it up?
okay. And I'll try to avoid some of the fine distinctions that come in. So there you can, if you want to be nitpicky, you could distinguish between liberalism and neoliberalism. But basically, let me try to give you a condensed version. And you've heard murmurings about this from other people. Patrick Deneen is not the only person writing on the subject, but he is one who wrote about it very eloquently and just captures a whole lot of political thought and brings it together in a very readable and understandable way. But essentially, in 1989, Francis Fukuyama wrote an article that then became a book, and the title is The End of History. And the idea there really was that we had come to a juncture now where all of the political problems that we had in the past had been solved by by liberalism, by this model and this economic model, and that as nations developed, they would likely join together, and now you would have this global village where commerce works this way. Everybody works together, and everybody enjoys this view of human freedom, economic freedom, free markets, and that this was now, I mean, basically all of the work that we had done to get to this point, all the conflicts, that those were over, and now here we have arrived. Here's the template, here's the vision. Well, at the time, that might sound idealistic and that might sound naive. Francis Fukuyama is a very good thinker, by the way, and he's a very realistic thinker too. So at the time, that was a very credible argument. Think
I was
about,
3 years old
I
then,
think
so I
that
wasn't paying a lot of attention. But anyway,
well, I was a little older than you, and I have a tangible memory from this time. It's not from Francis Fukuyama. I had no idea who he was at the time, but I do remember my dad returning from a trip with a piece of stone and handing it to me. And I said,
mm,
"What's this?" He said, "This, son, is a piece of history." And it was a piece of the wall that came down in 1989. So I think, historically speaking, that was a major symbol of, hey, we have arrived. The old regime, the old ways have crumbled. But what Patrick Deneen is saying in this book is that the idea of liberalism, or neoliberalism, however you want to say it, is a picture of limitlessness that runs into the hard reality of life. Limitlessness in terms of our own freedoms, sexual license. Well, there are problems that arise from that. Limitlessness in terms of economic policies, limitlessness in terms of consumerism. Well, there are hard realities there. We have ecological crises looming because of that. We have wastefulness. We have plundered natural resources in a way that is incredibly irresponsible to feed this limitless vision of limitless consumption and freedom. Now, I'm speaking in very general terms here because you asked me to give a quick condensed version.
mm,
So, his argument is that the failure of liberalism is its success, meaning that what's happening now, the breakdown, the collapse that we're seeing, is a direct logical outworking of liberalism. The idea that you place no constraints on anybody, no limits. So eventually, if if you let Pandora out of that box, what's going to happen is you're going to see various levels of breakdown, disintegration, social, economic, and otherwise, because we are in a world that we have to share. There are limited resources, and there are very different cultures who we are learning, even though this shouldn't be a surprise to us, do not share our view of human flourishing or our view of how freedom is expressed. In some ways, Nathan, I think you could point to 9/11 as one of those moments, those stark reminders that no, we're not at the end of history. It's not all
Well,
solved. It's not
okay.
all worked out.
Well,
So,
thank you for that.
yeah,
For
so
that
let's leave it
summary.
there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. Good off the cuff book review. That's Cameron with no prep right there at his finest. Um, the some of that plays into where he's going in this, and he has written a newer book called Regime Change. But a little
Yeah.
bit of that plays into here, Cameron, is that on one hand, if you're saying 1989, the 1990s were great, um, we have arrived. You have to have a fairly siloed view of so it is a globalistic enterprise economically, but it is not. But it's very myopic in the way that it sees who's winning and who's not in this time. And so fast forward that for several decades, and we come to a point where I think he says you have always historically had the few and the wealthy versus the many. So it's the few versus the many, and the wealthy and the systems versus those who are not benefiting from those systems. And um, history shows that this happens time and time again, and that you have two outcomes of that. You either have civil war or you have total anarchy. And so you have
Mm,
uprisings, revolutions, and whatnot when the vast majority of people who don't feel like they're benefiting from the system. And so he would say that if you look historically speaking, the things that all philosophers have worried about as far as the separation between representation and the people whom they're theoretically representing, and the economic tensions and extremes and sociological and political discord, America is now at the point that everybody has always feared when their culture got to that point, and that America uniquely tried to establish a way of bridging that gap between the few and the many. And it's interesting. He spends a lot of time in like on Madison, looking at like
yep.
ancient theory on this. So he talks about Plato's Republic, Aristotle farther on back. That the idea always was is that the way that you stabilize this idea of life together is that you have a common good, and you have a more Aristotelian vision of like the village, and people know and
Mhm.
appreciate and understand. And even if you yourself aren't your own blacksmith and you're the cobbler, you appreciate what the blacksmith is doing, and you can see the value of his work, and the person who's growing your food and you're repairing his shoes. And there's a very integrated concept of us and our localized production and our taking care of each other in an economy with a common vision of the common good. And that has been the primary vision of the past. And then the fear there is like, how does that scale? What happens when you hit a global, like even at like the old theories, like what is the largest possible functional city? And you hear this, actually I hear this like, what is the largest possible functional church? At what point does the number grow
Yeah.
beyond what you can socially cohere together
Right.
in a meaningful sense? And so Madison is interesting, and the American experiment is interesting in that it's not about having the local village and a small um, region. It's actually how do we multiply and expand this and find some protection, and that there would be an inherent disagreement between all these little pockets of representation, and there would be a little bit of distrust and discord and suspicion between the other groups. And we're going to build this out so that you have a House of Representatives, and you're going to really blow this idea of representation out to as many people in like the little segregated villages as much as possible would then come under a federalistic system. And so he's saying that America is a bit unique in its attempt to do this, but that the system that we live in we've outgrown that system in the sense that now you might have a representative who's representing 600,000 people and maybe more in some districts in some
Maybe
regions.
more. Yeah.
And so he's pushing into the how do you functionally reduce that gap between the few and the many, between the representatives. I mean, there's a strong chord here. This is the American Revolution. You had a group of people who
Yeah.
felt like they weren't being represented by economic elites on the other side of the ocean, and they felt really distanced from, in that case, geographically. But the history of
Mhm.
American politics has been that same sentiment on repeat, um, in a geographically local speaking of the United States, but a very cultural sense of separation there from the representation. And then the idea of the few who are benefiting and the many who are working and aren't benefiting from those systems. All of those pieces are right there. And so I think some of the stuff that he's putting his finger on has so much staying power. I think you used Rockstar because he's just simply identifying, and as he himself would say, this is not new to him. People have been writing and thinking about this, but he's articulating it very well. So that's the moment that we find ourselves in, um, and why Deneen is an important thinker in our time.
He's also a figure of some controversy because so let's bring in JD Vance here. So he has some of his fans have turned out to be quite influential in the long run. JD Vance being one of them, who Vance read his book, was was very appreciative of it, got in touch with Deneen, and I believe Deneen also played a role in Vance's eventual conversion to the Roman Catholic faith. And now, of course, JD Vance is the vice president. So one of the one of the things that I found interesting in the interview, and I'm gonna go ahead and say it, he's a slippery fellow in that interview, I think, because there are a couple of questions to him that he answers in a way that I think border on disingenuous. Sometimes he's evasive. So he first of all, there's a fun moment where the interviewer, and I can't remember his name. He's the gentleman who co-wrote Freakonomics, the book, and he's a very good interviewer, and he's also a very seasoned and experienced journalist. He asks him some fairly pointed questions, but at one point throughout the interview,
Stephen
Deneen
Dubner.
seems to both Stephen Dubner. Okay, thank you, Stephen Dubner. So Dubner asks him some pretty pointed questions throughout the interview. Nathan, it just seems to me, granted, I don't have access to Deneen's, heart or inward disposition, but it seems to me that he both seems to relish his role as an academic heretic. He gives himself all of these titles as
Mhm.
he's
Puppet
why is he an
Master.
academic heretic? Well, yeah, so he says, no, I'm not the puppet master here. I'm just a little mild mannered academic writing. But at one point, Dubner says, okay, you keep saying puppet master. It's twice. I've never said that you're a puppet master. Well, sort of a right wing political guru. Again, I was just quoting the Wall Street Journal. I didn't say that. But clearly, so he does have a level of influence that is unusual. He has a level of influence among acting politicians. And his ideas, so a book that's a harder sell is Regime Change. So I haven't read the whole thing yet. I've read a good bit of it. Here's what I will say in favor of Regime Change. It has his as always his very good writing. He's a gifted writer. He makes concrete proposals. So increase the two examples here. Increase the House of Representatives. Get it up to even maybe 6,000 people. Okay, I'll give you three. Decentralize Washington D.C. That's another one.
Yeah, this is a common one. Like,
Spread this out.
why is the Department of Agriculture in DC and not in Iowa? That's the conversation you're having.
Yes. That kind of thing. Oh, and so yeah, and also, how about we get some different people in the Chamber of Commerce?
Yep.
Get some actual farmers in there and maybe wage workers in there. So he's actually giving concrete, practical proposals, and you have to give him respect for that because it's one thing to take to the pages of the Atlantic or the New York Times and wax eloquent about the need for integrity and character. Not that we don't need that, but plenty of people roll their eyes at it because, yeah, okay, do you have any skin in the game? What's your actual proposal? So this book has some actual proposals. It's a harder sell because, and it comes down to one of the questions that he's asked is, or at least it comes up in the conversation, you know, what about, so you, Viktor Orban, the autocratic guy in Hungary, he's a fan of your work. Yeah, well, who wouldn't want to talk to, who wouldn't want to talk with somebody who is a major political voice in Europe? That's a disingenuous answer. Nobody is concerned that he's talking with a politician in Europe. It's who this politician is and what he represents. So there are concerns, and it is true, people misrepresent intellectuals all the time. This happens, and many people in their columns have painted a vision of Patrick Deneen that makes him fascist adjacent, which I don't think is fair. But it is it is true at the same time, it's true to say that he is closer with some of these figures and cozied up to some of them who are, I think, dangerous figures. And the fact that he tries to downplay it or say, "Oh, well, no, I'm just, here I'm just trying to go about, my business as an academic, and now I'm sort of people look at me differently now at the University of Notre Dame." That was another interesting moment, Nathan, the whole, well, some of my academic ambitions now are kind of closed down. And Dubner says, "Well, what would they be?" I mean, you're a tenured professor, you're at a major research university, and he kind of hems it, "Well, there are certain lectures that wouldn't be maybe offered to me, or, he won't deliver the Gifford lectures or something like that because he's a controversial figure." So, all that to say, I hope we're Deneen to hear this podcast, were this to cross his desk, or in some way he wouldn't feel misrepresented here. I think he's a formidable character. And the one thing I didn't appreciate about the interview is that he seems to simultaneously relish that and then try to downplay it and be a little clever about it.
And the interviewer does poke at him a little bit on that, I think.
Yeah.
But I think the conclusion to the interview, there are a couple things in here that I think Cameron are indicative of just the transformative time that we're in. So, first of all, you have a book that Barack Obama and Viktor Orban liked. So that's a okay. So play that however you want, um, and then you have so the outro, basically Stephen saying, "Hey," and this is also a little bit of a wake up call, like to the Democrats, like if you lost a formidable thinker like Patrick Deneen, you need to be asking yourself, "What are we doing here?" Um, so there's that thing going on there. But then there's another thing where I forget how he asked about, like, right now he says he's supporting the Republicans right now because he said the current iteration of the Republican Party is the party that acts left economically and acts right socially.
Economically, socially. Yeah.
And you do see this being played out where the kind of the MAGA version of republicanism is a very,
Mhm.
I don't know, other than to say pretty left economic vision. Um, it's a wild time because some of these categories don't make sense
Mm.
uh, in our short term history, but make sense in our long term history. And so
So let me
for
say a few
whatever it's
words.
worth, there before we bring some of this, I think into
Yeah.
like sort of more of the church adjacent kind of part of the conversation.
Well, so I want to say a few words about his sympathies to the populist movement, because he's not the only one here, by the way, and it's not just right wing figures who are, or or people who lean right of center who have sympathies with populism. I think another person who's very different intellectual from Patrick Deneen would be John Gray, the British skeptic, who is not in agreement with populist movements, but has some sympathies with them because of what the upheaval that they're experiencing in Great Britain. So one, and here where this has a specific bearing on Deneen and his views about post-liberalism. So one of the things that Patrick Deneen will say is that we are all post-liberal now because liberalism has collapsed. What precisely will replace it is still up in the air, according to Deneen. But he points out that one of the major places where you can point to the failings of liberalism was this vision of limitlessness. Well, one of the expressions of that was get rid of borders. Let's erase these arbitrary national boundaries, and then we have this kind of, well, do you remember when New World Order was said and voiced in non-ironic terms? That was kind of part of that vision too. But multiculturalism and that whole project has decisively failed. That's not a controversial statement. I mean, thinkers across the board will say that. And you can look to, so the immigration crisis that's happening all throughout the West right now, that is a major contributing factor to the growing frustration in populations. And it's part of what's fueling these populist movements. That's certainly true in England right now. It's certainly true in that's a big part of the debate and the arguments in America. And so he's pointing to that as one of the major instigators behind some of this upheaval, and also one of the ways that you can showcase that this blending of everything doesn't work. There are different ways of life. There are decisively different expressions of what comes after liberalism, by the way. China being one of them, Russia being one of them.
Islamic Caliphate
So
being one of them.
Islamic Caliphate being one of them. So that's and those are also pictures that the what you think if you're a Western politician, what you think that we've outgrown or that, is part of history forever, consigned to the dustbin of history, these you have whole nations that will prove you otherwise. That will
Well,
prove
so
otherwise. You have conflicts that you can point back to that proved otherwise. The war in Iraq proves otherwise. Not all people want that vision of freedom.
but this is the the goofy thing here. So the why liberalism fails, it can in some ways be summarized for me in the coexist bumper sticker. Do you remember those? Like, I
Right.
think some people might still. So,
Oh, yeah.
what do you when you put a coexist bumper sticker? Remember this. This is the bumper sticker. It says coexist, and all of the letters or the symbols of
Religious
different
iconography. Yep.
religious
Yeah.
iconography. So the T in exist is going to be a cross, um, and all the rest of them there. But the wild thing of that is that you're I keep going back to this old Far Side comic where you have the alien scientist and the one has a jar of humans and he has the cap off and then he has the cap off of a jar of bears and he's pouring humans into the jar of bears and the other scientist is yelling at him like Igor, you idiot, you're mixing incompatible specimen. Um,
Mhm.
there's a sense in which liberalism has a very small view of reality that thinks it sees and understands and knows everybody's motives. And so, like, the arrogance
That
of putting a coexist bumper sticker on your car is like, I understand how all of these are the same, even though all of these religions say that they're different from each other. I alone sit in a spot where I can see that they actually really are the same fundamentally. And then 9/11 happens. Like, it doesn't
yeah.
match onto reality and just like it shows an inability to think from a different person's perspective, which is hilarious because or ironic, I guess, because that is the inverse of what a more liberal educated order prizes itself in is being able to see like all the different options and seeing from different perspectives. And it just so clearly often doesn't, and then seems surprised when there's conflict. I'd
So, you're
I'll
right.
stop.
And that's no, that's such an important point to make. So, the vision of liberalism is incredibly homogeneous. It flattens things. And religion is fine as long as it's a purely private affair in a liberal order. That's always the conflict always erupts between the liberal order and public expressions of faith. Think about if you can remember back to when women wearing hijabs in France, and that was a major news item, and that was a huge controversy because it was seen as repressive, and in some cases they were trying to outlaw it in public in certain
Mhm.
places in France. But the Muslim population in France is massive. So this was creating unbelievable or you can remember the was it the Charlie Hebdo case where
Right?
there
Yeah.
was a satirical image of the Prophet Muhammad, and then that resulted in homicide. But also major conflicts with, we could think back to major conflicts with Christian bakers and gay weddings. These are the conflict erupts between public expressions of faith. So religion is a way of life, and I'm speaking in very very general terms. But the notion that religion is just a perfectly private individual affair, you can graft and mix and match, graft on whatever pieces you want. I like Tara Isabella Burton's way of labeling this as the religiously remixed. That only works if you have a very empty and hollow view of religion. Actually, that's not the way anybody in the past has ever looked at
Right.
religion.
Yeah. Well,
So,
okay, well,
yeah, but
let's pull some of these threads back together then, because we started off talking about has America lost its appetite for the common good? And we might just simply answer that question, yes. However, historically, religion was the common element, um,
Yeah.
the communal factor that gave everybody a similar idea of like, what are we doing here? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to accomplish?
What are
Um,
we pursuing together? Yeah,
what are we pursuing together?
absolutely.
And we have
That
we have
we
shared
worship
meaning.
together at this worship together at this mosque. This is our sacred text. This is how we wash ourselves.
Yeah, or
I
synagogue.
mean,
The sin bringing toge the sin
yeah,
the
yeah, just pick
synthesis
your
of bringing
example, but
together the
mhm.
yeah,
Yeah,
or the Hare Krishna temple, like, filling the like, religion has been that,
yep,
and obviously, we're
yep.
deeply in the Christian tradition here. I was just pointing out that shared meaning almost always historically has been a religiously rooted construct and concept of what it means to be something, except, and there's a big one, national pride and national organization. And so I don't think it's strange that I mean, obviously the Soviet Union did not see itself as bound together by a religious tradition. Communist China doesn't see itself as bound together by a religious tradition. Um, and so in light of a lack of shared meaning along religious language, the default position for seeing yourselves as collectively part of a group is by national borders, tribes, and geographic, location,
Mhm,
and
yeah.
region. And so
Distinctions.
that is the distinction that you fall back on is like, well, these are the people that I live beside, therefore we are a thing together. So you
Look,
can't
why did
really
Brit why
no, go ahead.
I mean, why did I mean, think about Brexit, Nathan, given what you've just said. Why did Great Britain I mean, a lot could be said there, but what are some of those tensions imposed by the European Union? A lot of these nations want to hold on to what makes them distinct, their customs, their
And
ideas,
they want to have
their
well,
rituals,
and they want to have some
and
form
they
of
wanna have some
self-direction.
independence.
Yeah, you don't want somebody
Yes.
sitting in
Yeah.
Luxembourg telling you what you can't eat for dinner in Leeds.
But
I
see,
mean,
that is the liberal vision right there. And so I think the common good is a problem in America because the word common is a problem in America. We're so fiercely individualistic now that it's hard to get any common in there in any way. I mean, I think people are very hungry for the good. They're very hungry to lead meaningful lives and they want to pursue the good. I think there's a renewed urgency there, but we're having a lot of trouble with the common part
you
because
remember
for years and years, yeah,
well, just it's a flashback. So how do you add fractions? You remember this? You're a fifth grade or whenever it is that you learn about denominators.
stop traumatizing me.
It does. So
Just kidding.
can you add fractions with different denominators? No, you got to find a common denominator, and then you can do math with the fractions.
Yeah,
And so I think
yeah.
what you will see happen as we move forward is those who can find common denominators are going to be the ones who can do math, who can build things. I'm using math here in more of a constructing a social vision of what's possible. It's it's kind of like I was thinking about this. Where was that somewhere? It's like, oh, the Amish built that so fast, and I'm like, the reason that we're impressed with that is because we've lost a vision of what humans who all see the world in the same way can accomplish together. Like, there's nothing unique about Amish construction. Like, they use the same tools and the same techniques as everybody else. It's just you have a bunch of guys who generally see the world in the same way and kind of like each other and are doing stuff together.
Yep.
And they aren't arguing about like I don't know. It's just you're just getting stuff done. Common denominator allows for the production and the building and the manufacturing and the flourishing of a lot of things. And so that the fact that we're surprised when we see things like that happen shows not how unique that group is. It's what we've lost culturally speaking. It's more of an indictment on ourselves, not a praise of the other.
And here, at the risk of opening a can of worms at kind of the end of the episode, maybe we do a second one where we talk a little bit more about this. Here is where I think Patrick Deneen is very good in his diagnosis, very sharp. His solutions, I think, are in some instances feasible and very sharp, but I think they fall short. because now he would say, I think, "I'm a political theorist, so I will try to I'm gonna put on my political theorist hat and try to offer some political solutions here." But I don't think that political solutions ultimately are going to do the work that that we want them to do here. We need deep, deep change that has to happen. Part of part of what happened with the United States, at least, and the part of why we struggle with the common is because the our imaginations have been captured by a very individualistic vision. And it's been going on for a long time. It's kind of at the heart of the American project, the vision of the self-made person, the vision of that you are never more yourself, like Emerson says, than when you go into the woods alone and are there alone with your authentic self and your authentic thoughts. And he writes about this so bewitchingly and so well, and that history is an impertinence or an injury if it gets in the way of your own self-becoming. So that vision, we've been working on that in poems and songs and movies for so long, it's captured the heart.
Yeah, but
And if you want to see deep change, that the heart has to be captured, and it can be,
well, it's a false
but
vision of it's a false vision of reality, Cameron, because it's not you in the
it is.
woods. It's so hunting season is coming up. I don't know if you've looked at the Georgia state hunting regulations or whatever state you're listening to this in. It's it's you going into the woods where there are 500 other people who are hunting the same 400 deer. That's the reality
With all
of
of your clothing and equipment and techniques that you've learned from
yeah,
others in
but
community.
yeah. So,
Or
so
I
I'm
always think
saying
of Thoreau with his cabin, his isolated in scare quotes there, cabin where, he could I don't know how far it wasn't that far, right? He could just walk from the cabin
oh,
to
yeah. I
town
mean,
and
the Lexington train
get
goes
all his
right by there.
supplies.
Yeah. No, I started to talk last year with the words Henry David Thoreau is a goober. But because um, it is this vision that doesn't quite comport with the reality that most people experience.
No,
And
it's a
to
romantic
describe
vision,
it
but
otherwise reeks of a form of elitism
yeah.
and disconnectedness that is going to be repulsive to the vast majority of people.
But here's
And
what I'm saying,
yeah,
Nathan, though. It's a romantic vision, and we can readily critique it and take it apart right here and point to just point to the practical realities behind the scenes. But the fact is, it's captured people's hearts. And my challenge to us and others is that it's possible to do that in a different way, to imagine things otherwise. So that means we need artists and politicians and thinkers and professors building a constructive vision of shared life and a common life. I think we can point there are artists who work in this terrain, in this field. I think Wendell Berry is one of them, especially in his fiction. I think that's what he's doing. I think Marilyn Robinson is doing that too. Now they I would say, Nathan, in terms of American literature, they're kind of exceptions. More
mhm.
you get the more individualistic vision is more of the norm. But if we want to do we need political solutions to some of these problems? Yeah, we do,
Sure.
but they're only gonna take you so far. Do we need greater representation for the common people, and do we need a way to shrink the gap between the few and the many? Absolutely, we do, and there are gonna be political solutions that are needed there, but those will be secondary to painting a larger vision of common life.
Okay. When
That's
I
the challenge before us, to capture hearts. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, okay. So aside from you becoming a great artist, or listener, or becoming a politician or whatever, what are the options before you to address this? And let me dial us back a couple thousand years here. Sermon time. We were just looking at this in church. James, chapter 2. When somebody comes in and they're wearing fine robes and a gold ring, do you give them a seat of, a preferred seat? And the person in rags, do you, I mean, Christianity has been addressing this diversity, and how do you form a commonality? How do you form a unity out of diversity? Like, this is kind of Jesus's thing. What does it mean to be part of the people of God when you have the manifold diversity of God's interest in the lives of all people? Um, and and here's something like when I was running around up in New England, speaking at a bunch of churches and colleges and stuff, that I found fascinating is that any church or organization that was pursuing unity never had it. And any group that wasn't pursuing unity always had it. And it struck me, unity is not a thing that you can go after and achieve. Like you can't get people to stand around in a circle and feel like they're unified. I mean, maybe some rhythmic breathing and drum music, but I'm talking about like real life. And it it occurred to me that unity is not a goal. Unity is a byproduct of a common identity. And once you think you have a common identity with other people, then you're deeply unified. Um, and this is and people point out like, well, Jesus prayed that they would be one. Yeah, that's true. But the prerequisite to that is that we would be in Christ, that we would see ourselves as sons and daughters of the Most High God. And so it's our common identity and the recognition of who our Father is, God, of the work of Christ in our lives, the salvation we've received by grace through faith, and the common life that we have together because of our common identity of who God is, our understanding of that, what He has done for us, and then the vision of what it is that we ought to be doing collectively as a result of that. All of that is deeply forming of an identity that produces unity. Like you don't like if you have clarity on identity, you don't have to go seeking unity. And so I think this is the place where the church becomes the bedrock and the foundational element for a lot of glory to God, but human flourishing as a byproduct of that. And so often in our political discourse, we're trying to pursue the byproduct as if it is the foundational element. And so when Cameron's speaking here and saying, you're going to have to go beyond politics, you're going to have to go beyond art, you're going to have to go beyond the academy, that's exactly what he means. All of those are downstream from groups of people who can organize themselves with a common identity. And I happen to think that Jesus's vision of that is the most diverse and inclusive form. And if you're like, well, hang on, that sounds rich. It's not. It was wild to me, particularly when I was doing a lot more campus ministry, that usually your campus ministries were the most diverse in every category of any club on campus. You walk into InterVarsity at a New England college or crew in a Southwestern, university, um, and you're going to see a whole spectrum of people that all have one thing in common. It is the most diverse group of people in many ways in many campuses. So it's an interesting thing here, Cameron, that I know it's like, the old joke about the little boy who goes to Sunday school and the teacher says, what's gray and has a bushy tail and climbs trees. And the little boy says, man, it sure sounds like a squirrel, but I better say Jesus. Um, it's like, there's like a kind of a Sunday school answer here. Everything is Jesus. But on the other hand, I think when we're thinking out loud in the work that we're doing and we're trying to really understand what is God saying to us in this time, how does He want us to live, and what's going on in culture, and then how do we translate in that gap in between them, there are things here that are not super complicated. Like you don't need Patrick to read Patrick Deneen in order to change the world around you. You need to faithfully band together with the people around you who are all pursuing what it is that Christ has for you and let Him shape and shift and change the world and the culture around you. And so it's not that we're naive to these things, but we don't become distracted to them. That whole message from Paul, like a soldier isn't caught up in civilian affairs. There's a sense in which we can know about it, but we can't recalibrate our lives off of these shifting patterns and ideas and things that bubble up. We have to be saying daily, thy will be done. What is it that you want me to see? What is it that you want me to do? And live in that. And if we find a group of people where we can do that together, we will have the deepest forms of unity that are unbreakable bonds and are not susceptible to weird ideas that float by that are transient. So that's my little sermonette in the midst of this, is just to recognize that time and time again for me, as I'm looking at the issues of the world that we're trying to solve, I really do see deep answers to these questions coming right out of the mouth and the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. And that makes Christian living pretty great.
More to say on this, I'm sure, is as we go forward. We look forward to hearing from you on some of this as well. But I think that's a very fitting point of closure for this particular episode. Hope this has been encouraging to you. And in case you missed it, you've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, Whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.